Minutes right after my divorce was finalized, I called my dad. Fire all 30 employees my in-laws planted in the company, I told him. Thank God I did, because that same evening my former mother-in-law came over yelling, demanding me to give them half my company. I just smiled, took a sip of my wine, and pulled out a file that would send her son to federal prison. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut toxic people out of your life for good. The afternoon sun hit my face as I stood on the wide concrete steps of the downtown Atlanta courthouse. The heavy mahogany doors closed behind me, severing my ties to the past 3 years of marital misery. I looked down at the manila folder in my hands, containing the dissolution of my marriage to Marcus. There were no tears blurring my vision, and my hands were perfectly steady. At 32 years old, serving as the chief operating officer of Dubois East Coast Logistics, I had survived far worse boardrooms and corporate battles than the pathetic display Marcus just put on in family court. He thought he could exhaust me with legal fees and petty demands, but he grossly underestimated my endurance. I took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air, feeling a profound sense of liberation wash over me. The heavy, suffocating weight of Marcus and his parasitic family was finally lifting. But the paperwork was only the first step. It was time to completely sever the infection they had spread through my family legacy. I unlocked my car, slid into the driver's seat, and immediately dialed my father. Harrison Dubois was a self-made man who built our transportation and logistics empire from a single leased delivery truck into a billion-dollar enterprise. He had always been too generous for his own good, especially when it came to his only daughter. He tolerated Marcus and his demanding relatives simply because he wanted to see me happy. But my father and I had been quietly preparing for this exact moment for 8 agonizing months. The phone rang only twice before his deep, familiar voice filled the car. "It is done," I said, my voice dropping into the same authoritative tone I used in executive meetings. The judge signed the papers. I am officially a single woman again. I heard a heavy sigh of relief on the other end of the line. "Congratulations, Nia," my father said warmly. "I am so incredibly proud of how you handled yourself through this nightmare. Now are we initiating protocol?" "Yes," I replied without a second of hesitation. "Fire them all, Dad. Every single one of them. The cousins, the uncles, the fake consultants, and the phantom warehouse supervisors. I want all 30 of the employees Beatrice planted in our company escorted off the premises by security right now. Cut their access badges, disable their corporate emails, and confiscate the company vehicles." "Consider it done," my father said, a dangerous edge of satisfaction creeping into his voice. "I have security standing by on all 5 floors of the headquarters. I will personally supervise the extraction. It is about time we take the trash out." As I ended the call and pulled out of the parking lot, I let my mind drift back to how this massive infestation had happened in the first place. When I first married Marcus, he presented himself as an ambitious entrepreneur. He was handsome, charismatic, and knew exactly how to play the role of a supportive partner. But beneath that polished exterior lay a fragile ego that was deeply threatened by my success. As a proud African-American woman running a major division of my family business, I worked 60-hour weeks managing supply chains and negotiating multi-million-dollar shipping contracts. Marcus hated that I made more money than him. He hated that my name commanded respect in rooms where he was invisible. His mother, Beatrice, quickly capitalized on his insecurities. Beatrice was a woman who practically lived at her church, wearing expensive hats and quoting scripture, while simultaneously plotting how to extract maximum wealth from our family. She played the devout matriarch perfectly, but her true religion was greed. Shortly after the wedding, she started cornering my father and me at Sunday dinners, laying on heavy guilt trips about community and legacy. She claimed it was our duty as successful Black business owners to uplift the extended family. She begged us to give her nephew a chance in the accounting department. Then it was her brother who needed a management position in the warehouse. Before long, Marcus was heavily pushing to hire his cousins, claiming he was building a trusted inner circle to help me manage the workload. I wanted to trust my husband, My father wanted to support his new son-in-law, so we opened our doors. We created positions with generous salaries, comprehensive benefits, and company cars. We thought we were providing opportunities for upward mobility. Instead, we invited 30 parasites to drain our resources. The reality of their employment was a massive insulting joke. Marcus' cousin, who was hired as a regional safety inspector at a six-figure salary, had not swiped his badge into the building in over 6 months. Beatrice's brother managed to crash 2 company-issued luxury SUVs while driving under the influence, but Marcus hid the police reports and authorized company funds to cover the damages. And then there was Sarah. Sarah was my brother-in-law's wife, a white woman who Beatrice treated like absolute royalty. Beatrice constantly paraded Sarah around as the gold standard of womanhood. She praised Sarah for staying home, taking care of her husband, and knowing her place. Beatrice never missed a chance to compare us, using Sarah and her traditional lifestyle as a weapon to belittle my ambition. At every holiday gathering, Beatrice would loudly remark about how Sarah kept a flawless home while my hands were too busy holding briefcases to hold a frying pan. She implied that my dedication to our logistics empire was the reason Marcus was unhappy, making racist and sexist microaggressions about how Black women who work too hard end up driving their men away. But the worst part was that Sarah's brother was one of the 30 people we hired. We brought him on as a logistics coordinator, and I recently discovered he had been funneling money out of the employee union fund to pay off his mounting gambling debts. All of them, from Beatrice to Marcus to Sarah, acted like they were vastly superior to me while literally surviving off the paychecks my family provided. They viewed the Dubois Corporation as their personal ATM, and they treated me with absolute contempt while swiping my credit cards. I navigated the highway traffic feeling the adrenaline pumping through my veins. The purge was happening right now. I could perfectly picture the chaos unfolding back at the corporate headquarters. 30 entitled people who had not done a hard day of work in 3 years were currently being handed cardboard boxes and escorted to the elevators by armed security guards. They would be screaming, demanding to speak to Marcus, threatening to sue, but none of it would matter. My father was a titan in the industry, and when he laid down the law, the ground shook. I turned onto the winding private road leading to my estate. The towering oak trees cast long afternoon shadows across the driveway. I parked my car in the garage and walked into the grand foyer of my home. The house was quiet, peaceful, and entirely mine. The heavy silence was a stark contrast to the toxic noise that had filled my life for the past 3 years. I kicked off my heels, walked into the massive gourmet kitchen, and opened a bottle of expensive red wine I had been saving for a special occasion. Today was definitely a special occasion. I poured myself a generous glass and walked into the living room, sinking into the plush leather sofa. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine, savoring the rich, complex flavor. The first phase of my counterattack was complete. I had severed their primary income source and stripped them of their unearned titles. But I knew this quiet moment was only the calm before the storm. You do not cut off a family of leeches without expecting them to try and bite back. Marcus and Beatrice were arrogant and deeply entitled. They would not accept this termination quietly. They would view it as an act of war, and they would come for me believing they still held power over my life. They thought my success belonged to them. As I took another sip of my wine, the security notification on my phone illuminated the dark room. Motion detected at the front gate. I glanced at the live camera feed and smiled a cold, calculated smile. There they were. Beatrice, Marcus, and Sarah practically frothing at the mouth as they buzzed the intercom. They had come to demand their money, to scream about fairness, and to threaten my empire. They had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 8 months working with federal agents and that I was sitting on a mountain of evidence that would destroy them all. "Let them in," I whispered to the empty room, pressing the button to open the main gate. The real game was just beginning. The heavy iron wheels of the front gate had barely stopped grinding before the thunderous pounding echoed from my front door. It was a desperate, frantic rhythm, the sound of people who realized their golden goose had just locked them out of the barn. I did not get up from the sofa. I did not set down my wine glass. I simply watched the heavy oak door rattle on its hinges before the lock clicked open, and the three of them spilled into my pristine foyer like a flash flood of pure, unadulterated rage. Marcus led the pack, his expensive tailored jacket completely wrinkled, his silk tie loosened and hanging lopsided around his neck. Sweat glistened on his forehead, and his chest heaved as if he had just run a marathon instead of driving over from the office. Behind him stood Beatrice, her face contorted into a mask of righteous fury, her usually immaculate hair wild and disheveled. Sarah brought up the rear, her pale skin flushed a bright, angry crimson, her hands clutching her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. They moved into my living room with erratic, disjointed energy, pacing back and forth, waving their arms, completely invading the calm, peaceful space I had spent the last hour enjoying. "Where is your father?" Nia Marcus roared, slamming his fist against the marble console table near the entry. "Where is Harrison? You tell that old man to come out here right now and face me after what he did. You cannot just do this. You cannot just turn our entire lives upside down because you felt like throwing a tantrum in family court." I remained completely still on the leather sofa, crossing one leg over the other, the dark red liquid in my glass swirling gently with the slight movement of my hand. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I just watched them. To an outside observer, the contrast would have been dizzying. They were a whirlwind of chaotic, panicked motion, their eyes darting around the room, their voices overlapping in a deafening chorus of entitlement, while I sat in the center of the storm, a monument of absolute ice. "You heartless, ungrateful pharaoh," Beatrice shrieked, stepping directly into my line of sight and pointing a manicured finger inches from my nose. "The church will hear about this, Nia. I will stand in front of the entire congregation this Sunday and let everyone know exactly what kind of malicious, wicked woman you really are." 30 people. 30. God-fearing, honest members of our community turned out into the street like dogs, security guards putting their hands on my nephews, treating my brother like a common criminal in front of the entire staff. Do you think God sleeps, Nia? Do you think your family wealth can insulate you from the wrath of the Almighty? I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine, letting the rich flavor settle on my tongue before I spoke. My voice was a cool, quiet contrast to her screeching. "Your brother was escorted out because he crashed 2 company vehicles while intoxicated and tried to use corporate funds to pay off the police, Beatrice. And your nephews have not actually done an hour of measurable work since the day we put them on the payroll. They were not turned out into the street. They were removed from a property they were actively robbing." "Don't you dare talk about my family that way." Sarah injected her voice, high-pitched and trembling with a dangerous mixture of tears and venom. She stepped up beside Beatrice, her eyes wild as she looked down at me sitting on the sofa. "My brother was a director, level coordinator, Nia. He has a family to support. He has a mortgage. You had your armed thugs drag him out of his office past people he has managed for years. The humiliation alone is going to ruin his career. You did this out of pure, unadulterated spite because you could not handle the fact that Marcus wanted out of this miserable marriage. You are a bitter, lonely woman, and you are trying to destroy everyone else. Happiness just because you are failing at your own life." Sarah's words hung in the air, a pathetic attempt to reverse the narrative and make me the villain of my own betrayal. I looked at her, noting the expensive diamond earrings dangling from her ears, the luxury watch on her wrist, and the premium leather of her handbag. Every single luxury she possessed had been subsidized by the very corporate account her brother had been systematically draining. She lived in a world built on Dubois money, while actively looking down on the black woman who signed the paychecks. "Sarah," I said softly, my gaze completely unfazed by her outburst. "Your brother was not a coordinator. He was a thief. And if you are so concerned about his career, I suggest you ask him where the $40,000 from our employee union fund disappeared to last month, because the auditors found his signature on the withdrawal slips." Sarah's face went completely pale, her mouth opening and closed as she looked toward Marcus for assistance. Marcus stepped forward, shoved his hands into his pockets, and began pacing the length of the rug, his voice rising to a full-throat bellow. "This is not about the employees, Nia, and you know it," Marcus yelled, his eyes bloodshot as he stared down at me. "This is a calculated illegal retaliation because the divorce did not go exactly the way you wanted. You think because your name is on the building, you can just strip away my livelihood. I am your husband. I spent 3 years helping you build that logistics network. I gave up my own entrepreneurial dreams to sit in those boring management meetings and support your family company. You cannot just fire my entire support system and freeze my corporate accounts 15 minutes after the judge signs a decree. You did not build anything, Marcus," I replied, my voice remaining perfectly level. "You sat in an air-conditioned office that my father paid for, drove a car that my father leased, and spent your afternoons planning weekend trips with your assistant using a company credit card. You did not give up your dreams because you never had any. You just found a family willing to finance your laziness, and you mistook our generosity for your entitlement." Marcus slammed his hands down on the back of the armchair opposite me, leaning his weight forward, his face inches from mine. "Listen to me very carefully," Nia Han snarled, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register. "There is no prenuptial agreement. You were too proud and too in love to insist on one when we got married. Under the laws of this state, everything we acquired during this marriage is considered marital property. That means 50% of your logistics division belongs to me, 50% of the capital, 50% of the assets, and 50% of this very house. My lawyer is already drafting the petition. If you think you can just freeze me out and walk away clean, you are completely insane. I will drag your family name through every courtroom in Georgia. I will expose the internal financial records to the media. I will bankrupt your father's legacy before I let you leave me with nothing." Beatrice nodded vigorously behind him, her expression smug and vindictive. "That is right, Marcus. Take what is rightfully yours. We built that girl, we supported her, and this is how she repays us. With weapons and security guards. She owes you everything, Marcus." Sarah chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension. "You think you are so smart, Nia. You think because you went to an Ivy League school and hold a big corporate title, you can just look down on us and treat us like garbage? But the law does not care about your pride. Marcus has rights. My family has rights. You are going to sign those accounts back over to us tonight, or we will make sure the entire city knows what kind of corrupt, fraudulent operation the Dubois family is running." I looked at the three of them, their faces twisted with greed, their bodies practically vibrating with the frantic energy of an animal backed into a corner. They truly believed they had a move left on the board. They truly thought that a missing piece of paperwork from 3 years ago was going to save them from the avalanche that was about to hit. I slowly set my wine glass down on the glass coffee table, the crystal making a sharp, clean click against the surface. The sound seemed to slice through their overlapping shouting, bringing a sudden tense silence to the room. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my trousers, and looked Marcus directly in the eye. The silence stretched for 3 agonizing seconds before I opened my mouth to respond. 50%, I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue as if tasting something incredibly sour. You want half of an empire you spent 3 years actively trying to dismantle from the inside out just because you feel entitled to a reward for your infidelity. Marcus' face twisted into an ugly defensive snarl, his hands balled into fists at his sides, and he took another step toward me, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "Do not stand there and preach to me about vows, Nia," he spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You broke your vows the day you decided your title was more important than your husband. You want to talk about my infidelity? Let us talk about why it happened. Let us talk about the cold dinners. Let us talk about the endless business trips to the West Coast. Let us talk about how I had to schedule an appointment with your secretary just to get 30 minutes of your time on a Sunday afternoon." He began pacing again, throwing his arms up in exasperated theatrical gestures. "I was lonely, Nia. I was living in a mansion with a ghost. You were never here, and when you were here, your mind was a million miles away, negotiating freight rates and supply chain logistics. You did not want a husband, you wanted an accessory. You wanted a well-dressed prop to stand next to you at your corporate galas so you could present the image of a perfect power couple. But behind closed doors, you treated me exactly like you treat your warehouse managers. You barked orders. You expected compliance. You never once asked me how I was doing or what I needed to feel like a man in my own home. I watched him perform his little monologue, noting how seamlessly he shifted the blame for his own moral failings entirely onto my shoulders. He was trying to rewrite history to justify his affair with a 24-year-old administrative assistant. Chloe actually looked at me when I spoke. Marcus continued, his voice softening into a pathetic plea for sympathy. She listened to me. She made me feel valued. She did not challenge my every decision or make me feel inadequate because I did not graduate from an Ivy League school. She gave me the respect and the peace that you were completely incapable of providing. You drove me to her, Nia. You starved me of affection and respect until I had no choice but to find it somewhere else. And now you want to punish me by stripping away my livelihood. It is sick. You are sick. Before I could even process the absolute audacity of his excuses, Beatrice stepped around her son, positioning herself directly in front of me. She straightened her posture, pulling her designer cardigan tight across her chest. Her eyes were dark and hard, entirely devoid of the maternal warmth she so frequently faked at church gatherings. My son is right, she declared, her voice carrying the commanding cadence of a Sunday morning sermon. You drove him away, Nia. I prayed for you. I got down on my knees every single night and prayed that the Lord would soften your hardened heart. But you are entirely consumed by your own pride. You parade around this city acting like you are untouchable. But look at your life. Your home is empty. Your marriage is broken. You are a failure in the eyes of God and in the eyes of anyone who knows what a real marriage requires. Beatrice took a step closer, invading my personal space. She smelled heavily of the signature Chanel perfume I had purchased for her last Christmas. The sheer hypocrisy of her wearing my money while tearing down my character was staggering. You think your money makes you a prize? Beatrice sneered, looking me up and down with absolute disgust. You think your degrees and your tailored suits make you superior, but they make you unnatural. A true woman knows how to build a home. A true woman knows how to nurture her husband and protect his peace. But you Black women of your generation are so obsessed with being strong and independent that you completely forget how to submit. You forget how to be soft. You want to act like the man of the house, and then you act shocked when your husband goes out and finds a real woman to give him what he naturally craves. She gestured wildly toward Sarah, who was standing quietly in the background, nodding along with every toxic word her mother-in-law delivered. Look at Sarah, Beatrice commanded. She knows her place. She stepped away from her career to support my eldest son. She keeps a beautiful home. She respects her husband's leadership. She is the gold standard of what a wife should be. She knows how to speak to a man without emasculating him. But you, Nia, you are exactly what is wrong with our culture today. You are just another angry, aggressive Black woman who cannot keep a family together because your ego is too massive to fit inside a traditional marriage. The racial and gendered microaggressions poured out of her mouth like toxic sludge. Beatrice was a Black woman herself, yet she had completely internalized the most damaging stereotypes about Black women and weaponized them against me to protect her cheating son. She was elevating a white woman who contributed absolutely nothing to their family wealth, while degrading the Black woman who was currently financing all of their lives. It was a masterclass in internalized misogyny and misplaced racial hierarchy. What good is all this money if you cannot even fulfill your basic biological duties? Beatrice continued, her voice dropping into a harsh, vicious whisper meant to cut me to the bone. 32 years old and not a single child to show for it. You were too busy climbing the corporate ladder to give my son an heir. You denied him a family because you were too selfish to take a few months off from your precious shipping contracts. You are an empty vessel, Nia. You have millions of dollars in the bank, but you are entirely worthless as a wife and a mother. No wonder Marcus had to look elsewhere. No wonder he needed comfort. You gave him absolutely nothing of substance. She crossed her arms over her chest, looking at me with a mixture of pity and triumph. She truly believed her words were destroying me. She thought she had found my weak spot and was twisting the knife, assuming I would break down in tears or fly into an emotional rage. That was the response she wanted. She wanted me to become the angry black woman she had just described so she could validate her own twisted narrative. She wanted me to scream and throw things so Marcus could use my emotional reaction as leverage in the divorce proceedings. But I did not give her the satisfaction. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I simply stood there absorbing the sheer magnitude of their delusion. They were standing in a $10 million mansion that my family built, wearing clothes my credit cards paid for, demanding half of my generational wealth while simultaneously telling me I was worthless. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain that level of entitlement was genuinely fascinating to witness. Marcus stepped up beside his mother, clearly emboldened by her vicious attack. "So you are going to sign the paperwork, Nia," he demanded, pointing a finger at my chest. "You are going to instruct your father to reinstate my family at the company tomorrow morning, and you are going to sit down with my lawyers to hash out a fair, equitable division of the marital assets. Because if you do not, I promise you I will take this narrative public. I will tell every business magazine and local news outlet exactly how the great Nia Dubois treats her husband. I will expose you as a cold, calculated narcissist who prioritizes profit over people. Your precious family reputation will be ruined." I looked at Marcus, taking in his desperate red-rimmed eyes and his trembling hands. I looked at Beatrice with her false, righteous indignation and her toxic maternal pride. I let the silence stretch out in the room, allowing the echoes of their insults to fade into the high ceilings of my living room. They had played their hands. They had fired their best shots, believing their emotional manipulation and threats of public extortion would force me into submission. They thought they were the predators cornering their prey. They had no idea they were already caught in a trap that had been meticulously constructed over the last 8 months. Before Marcus could catch his breath to launch into another tirade, Sarah stepped forward, breaking the brief silence. She moved with an exaggerated, delicate grace, smoothing down the skirt of her pristine pastel dress. She positioned herself next to her mother-in-law, presenting a united front of delusional superiority. I watched her clutch her Hermes Birkin bag, a bag I knew for a fact cost $20,000, and was purchased using a corporate card Marcus had supposedly assigned to a vendor. "You know, Nia, I really used to feel sorry for you." Sarah began, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet condescension that grated against my ears. "I used to watch you rush out the door at 5 in the morning, your hair pulled back, practically buzzing with stress. And I would just pity you. You have all this money, all this supposed power, but you have absolutely no idea how to actually be a woman. You never learned how to cultivate a soft life." She smiled, a small, pitying smile that was designed to make me feel small. "A husband does not want a CEO in his bed, Nia. He wants a wife. He wants a peaceful harbor to return to after he has been out conquering the world. When my husband comes home from the office, I meet him at the door. The house is immaculate. Dinner is in the oven. I make sure the temperature is perfectly regulated and the ambiance is soothing. I do not interrogate him about freight margins or quarterly projections. I ask him how his heart is feeling. I nurture him. That is what a man like Marcus needed." I took a slow breath, letting the absolute absurdity of her words wash over me. Sarah was lecturing me about the hard work of maintaining a home while completely ignoring the reality of how her lifestyle was funded. Her peaceful harbor was a 7-bedroom estate in Alpharetta that required a full-time housekeeper, a landscaping crew, and a private chef, all of which were secretly billed to my logistics company under the guise of facility maintenance. Her husband, my brother-in-law, did not conquer the world. He played golf 3 days a week and spent the rest of his time gambling away corporate funds at underground poker games in Buckhead. "You wear the pants in the relationship?" Sarah continued, growing more confident as Beatrice nodded approvingly beside her. "You stripped Marcus of his masculinity the moment you refused to let him take the title of CEO. You forced him to play second fiddle to his own wife. Do you have any idea how deeply humiliating that is for a traditional man? It goes against nature. If you had just stepped back, if you had just swallowed your pride and let him lead the company, none of this would be happening. You pushed him into Chloe's arms because you refused to be soft. You refused to submit. Sarah took a step closer, shaking her head in mock sorrow. Chloe is a sweet girl. She understands traditional values. She knows how to look up to a man and make him feel like a provider. Marcus finally found someone who allows him to be the man of the house. You cannot compete with that, Nia, no matter how many millions you have in your bank account. You will end up sitting in this massive empty house all by yourself, surrounded by your shipping contracts and your balance sheets, while Marcus builds a real loving family with a woman who actually knows how to treat him. The sheer audacity of her lecture was almost impressive. Here was a woman who had never worked a 40-hour week in her entire life, standing in my home telling me I was a failure. While Sarah spent her mornings taking private Pilates classes and browsing high-end boutiques, I was up before dawn analyzing global market trends, negotiating with international trade unions, and ensuring that thousands of employees received their paychecks on time. I carried the weight of $1 billion empire on my shoulders so that parasites like her could play house and pretend they were living out some traditional domestic fantasy. You think your money gives you the right to treat us like peasants? Sarah's voice grew sharper, losing some of its sickly sweet coating as her true resentment bled through. You think you can just snap your fingers and throw my brother out on the street? My brother is a good man. He was providing a critical service to your company, coordinating massive accounts and keeping your warehouses running smoothly. And you humiliated him. You had him escorted out like a criminal just to stroke your own bruised ego. I kept my expression perfectly blank. Her brother had not coordinated a single account in 3 years. His entire job consisted of approving fake invoices and transferring the funds into offshore shell companies that Marcus had set up. He was not a good man providing a critical service. He was a degenerate thief who used my family legacy as his personal piggy bank. But I let her keep talking. I let her dig the hole deeper. We are a family built on strong moral foundations, Sarah declared, lifting her chin proudly. We believe in loyalty. We believe in supporting each other through thick and thin. You never fit in with us, Nia. You were always too arrogant, too obsessed with your own independence to truly become part of this family. We tried to welcome you. Beatrice welcomed you with open arms, and you spat in our faces. She gestured toward Marcus, who was watching me with a smug, satisfied smirk, clearly enjoying seeing his sister-in-law tear me down. Marcus deserves half of everything, Sarah insisted. He sacrificed his prime years dealing with your cold, calculating personality. He stood by your side while you built your precious logistics empire, and he deserves to be compensated for his emotional labor. You should be writing him a check right now as an apology for wasting his time. If you had any shred of decency left, you would sign those settlement papers and beg him for forgiveness. But we all know you do not have a decent bone in your body. Sarah crossed her arms over her chest, mirroring Beatrice's stance. We are not leaving until you make this right. You are going to call your security team and clear my brother's name. You are going to reinstate Marcus, and you are going to agree to the 50% split. Because if you do not, we will take this to the media. We will tell everyone exactly how the Dubois family operates. We will tell the world that you are a bitter, vindictive woman who destroys families just because she cannot keep her own husband happy. I looked at Sarah, taking in the absolute certainty in her eyes. She genuinely believed her own narrative. She had lived in this echo chamber of entitlement and delusion for so long that she could no longer distinguish between reality and the fiction Beatrice had spun for her. She truly thought her status as the perfect submissive white housewife gave her the moral high ground to walk into a black woman house and demand half of her generational wealth. The air in the living room felt thick with their collective arrogance. They were a united front of parasites, feeding off each other's toxic energy, completely convinced of their own untouchable superiority. Marcus was nodding along with Sarah's words. Beatrice was looking at me with undisguised contempt. They had laid out all their threats. They had delivered all their insults. They had played every card they thought they had, assuming I was cornered and defenseless against their public extortion. I remained seated on the sofa, feeling the cool, smooth glass of my wineglass against my fingertips. I did not raise my voice to defend my femininity. I did not justify my grueling work hours. I did not waste my breath trying to explain the crushing burden of carrying an entire corporation while managing a treacherous, ungrateful husband. Explanations were for equals, and the people standing in my living room were nothing more than scavengers whose time had finally run out. I took one last sip of my wine, setting the glass down on a customized coaster. I leaned back into the plush leather cushions and let a slow, chilling smile spread across my face. It was the kind of smile that did not reach my eyes. The kind of smile that made Marcus take a sudden, hesitant step backward, his false bravado faltering for just a fraction of a second. I uncrossed my legs and reached for the leather briefcase I had placed on the side table earlier that evening. The time for letting them speak was over. It was time to show them exactly what a cold, calculating CEO looks like when she goes to war. I unclasped the solid brass latches of my briefcase. The sharp metallic clicks echoed through the quiet living room, instantly slicing through the thick blanket of their collective arrogance. I reached inside and withdrew a massive, heavy stack of manila folders bound tightly together by thick rubber bands. I did not toss them gently. I dropped the entire stack directly onto the center of the glass coffee table with a loud, resounding thud that made Marcus physically flinch and take a step back. "You want to talk about family loyalty?" I began, my voice carrying the steady, dangerous calm of a judge delivering a life sentence. "You want to stand in my home and talk about how I treated you like peasants, how I disrespected your invaluable contributions to my empire, and how much I owe you for your hard work. Let us stop relying on your vivid imaginations and start reviewing the actual receipts." I snapped the rubber band off the first folder and flipped it open, smoothing my hand over the top printed document. "Let us start with your beloved nephew, Beatrice, the young man Marcus insisted we hire as the regional safety inspector for the entire eastern seaboard. A vital corporate role with a base salary of $120,000 a year, complete with full medical benefits and an unrestricted corporate expense account. Do you know the last time your nephew actually stepped foot inside one of my distribution centers?" I slid a printed security access log across the glass table toward her. "April 2nd. It is now late October. He has not swiped his security badge in over 6 months. He has been collecting a 6-figure salary to sit on a rented couch in Miami Beach and post pictures of his brand new jet ski on Instagram. A jet ski he purchased using our corporate credit card, classifying it as a marine safety training vehicle." Beatrice shifted uncomfortably, her righteous posture faltering for a fraction of a second before she attempted to defend him. "He was working remotely," she stammered, her voice losing its previous commanding thunder. "He was analyzing safety reports from home. You cannot expect a young executive to be confined to a warehouse floor every single day. He does not even have a company laptop registered to his name." "Beatrice," I countered, shutting her down instantly. "He is a ghost employee. He is a parasite, but he is nothing compared to your brother." I grabbed the second folder and tossed it next to the first. "Let us talk about the man you begged me to hire because he needed a second chance after his last stint in county jail. We gave him a high-level managerial position in the Baltimore facility. We gave him a company-issued luxury SUV to ensure he could commute comfortably. And how did he repay that incredible generosity? He crashed the vehicle into a commercial storefront at 2 a.m. while severely under the influence of narcotics. And when we issued him a replacement vehicle, because Marcus claimed the first accident was a sudden mechanical failure, he crashed the second one into a parked police cruiser just 3 weeks later." I turned my gaze directly to Marcus, locking eyes with my soon-to-be ex-husband. "You intercepted those police reports, Marcus? You authorized corporate emergency funds to quietly pay off the property damages and keep your uncle out of a prison cell. You committed deliberate corporate fraud to cover up his crimes because you knew I would have fired him on the spot." Marcus swallowed hard, the arrogant smirk completely vanishing from his face. The blood drained from his cheeks as he stared at the folders on the table, realizing for the first time that his sloppy trails of deception had been meticulously tracked. But the absolute crown jewel of this parasitic collection belongs to your family, Sarah, I said, reaching for the thickest folder of them all. It was a bright red file containing hundreds of pages of forensic audits from our external accounting firm. Sarah crossed her arms tightly over her chest, trying to maintain her smug white savior superiority, but I could clearly see the slight tremble in her manicured fingers. She knew her brother was a liability, but she had no idea how deep his betrayal ran. Your brother was supposed to be a senior logistics coordinator, I continued, standing up and walking slowly around the coffee table until I was standing directly in front of her. He was supposed to be the hardworking traditional provider you just spent the last 10 minutes preaching about. He was supposed to be the man bringing home an honest paycheck to support his traditional family. But my auditors noticed some glaring irregularities in the Employee Union Relief Fund. That is money our hardworking warehouse staff contributes from their own paychecks to support their peers during medical emergencies or personal crises. It is a sacred fund. Sarah's face tightened into a defensive glare. My brother is a good man, she shot back, her voice shaking. He would never touch that money. You are just trying to make us look bad because you are bitter. I have the withdrawal slips right here, Sarah, I said, tapping a manicured nail against the red folder. 32 separate unauthorized transfers approved by your brother, funneling a total of $40,000 into an untraceable offshore account. We hired top-tier private investigators to follow the money trail. Do you want to know where those stolen funds went? They went directly to underground poker games. They went to illegal sports betting syndicates. Your brother is a degenerate gambler who stole from working-class families to fund his addiction. Sarah took a ragged breath, stepping back as if I had physically struck her. And Marcus knew all about it, I added, turning back to the men in the room. He covered up the embezzlement because he was using your brother to forge shipping invoices for his own phantom consulting firm. You all fed off the same trough, protecting each other's crimes while smiling in my face and cashing my checks. The sheer weight of the evidence crushed the remaining air out of the room. The false bravado that had fueled their grand entrance completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the pathetic reality of their actions. Beatrice sank onto the edge of a nearby armchair, clutching her chest as if she might faint, her religious hypocrisy laid bare on my coffee table. Marcus was completely silent, his eyes darting frantically toward the front door, as if calculating whether he could simply run away and escape the consequences. But Sarah was a different breed of entitled. When backed into a corner, her instinct was not to retreat or reflect on her own complicity. Her instinct was to burn everything down. Her face flushed a violent shade of crimson, transitioning from shock to a desperate, hysterical rage. She was not used to being held accountable, and she certainly was not used to being dismantled by a black woman she viewed as beneath her. "You are making this all up!" Sarah screamed, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You fabricated these documents to frame my brother because you are a bitter, jealous woman. You hate that I have a happy marriage and you do not. But it does not matter what fake papers you print out. Nia, do you hear me? It does not matter at all. Because the court of public opinion does not care about your little corporate audits." She reached into her expensive handbag and pulled out her phone, waving it in the air like a weapon. "I have thousands of followers online. I know reporters at local news stations in Atlanta. I will go on every social media platform tonight and tell the world exactly how the Dubois family operates. I will tell them that you are a racist, elitist tyrant who fires innocent people without cause just to assert dominance." Her voice grew louder, echoing off the high ceilings as she outlined her desperate smear campaign. "I will tell them you abuse your employees. I will say you create a toxic, hostile work environment and that you systematically targeted my family because you hate traditional women. I will play the victim so perfectly that by tomorrow morning, your company will be trending for all the wrong reasons. Boycotts, protests, negative press. The public loves a story about a wealthy, corrupt CEO destroying a working-class family. Your precious clients will cancel their shipping contracts the second they see the headlines. You will lose everything. Marcus suddenly found his voice again, latching onto Sarah's threat, like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. His posture straightened, and a fraction of his smugness returned. She is right, Nia, he sneered, stepping up beside his sister-in-law. You might have your little files, but you cannot survive a massive public relations nightmare. The media will eat you alive. You reinstate our corporate access, you authorize the 50% split of the assets, or we walk out that door right now and press send on the biggest scandal your family has ever seen. The conflict hovered in the air, a heavy, suffocating blanket of tension. They truly believed they had found my ultimate vulnerability. They thought the threat of public humiliation and cancel culture would force me to fold, assuming my father's corporate legacy was too fragile to withstand a media storm fueled by a crying white woman playing the victim. I stood in silence, letting their triumphant smirks return, letting them savor their illusion of victory for just a few moments longer. Press send. The two words left my lips with the sharp precision of a tailored blade. I did not blink. I did not shift my weight. I simply stared at Sarah and her raised smartphone, waiting for her to execute the grand threat she believed would bring my empire to its knees. Sarah's hand wavered. The triumphant smirk that had been plastered across her face faltered as the reality of my absolute indifference hit her. Marcus and Beatrice exchanged a panicked, bewildered glance. This was not the script they had written in their heads. In their version of reality, the mighty Nia Dubois was supposed to crumble, drop to her knees, and beg them to keep her family name out of the mud. They expected a negotiation. I gave them an eviction notice. I told you to press send, I repeated, taking a slow step toward them. Go live right now, Sarah. Tell your thousands of followers all about my toxic behavior. Tell them how I fired your brother. But make sure you also tell them that the Federal Bureau of Investigation is currently reviewing his bank statements. Tell them about the offshore accounts and the gambling debts. In fact, I can call the local news stations for you. We can do an exclusive primetime interview right here in my living room. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her phone down. You are bluffing, he muttered, though his voice lacked any real conviction. You would never risk the company's stock price over a personal vendetta. I am not bluffing, Marcus, I said softly. I am simply done playing with you. You have exactly 30 seconds to vacate my property before I have my security team physically remove you for trespassing. And if you ever show your faces at my home or my corporate offices again, I will have you arrested. Now get out. The retreat was far less glamorous than their entrance. Realizing that their extortion attempt had spectacularly failed, they scrambled toward the front door, hurling frantic profanities over their shoulders. Beatrice screamed about divine retribution while Marcus kicked a decorative planter near the entryway, shattering it across the marble tiles. I stood perfectly still, watching the heavy oak door slam shut behind them. I locked the deadbolt, reset the security alarms, and calmly picked up a broom to sweep up the broken ceramic. The trash had finally taken itself out. But the silence in my house that night was merely the eye of the hurricane. By 6 o'clock the following morning, the storm officially made landfall. My phone began vibrating relentlessly on my nightstand. The caller ID flashed the name of my director of public relations. I answered the call knowing exactly what was waiting for me on the other end of the line. You need to check your social media feeds immediately, my PR director said, her voice tight with professional anxiety. Sarah and your mother-in-law went live a few hours ago. The videos have already been stitched, shared, and reposted across 4 different platforms. It is gaining traction fast, Nia. We are getting calls from local journalists asking for comments on allegations of wrongful termination and hostile workplace environments. I opened my tablet and navigated to the links she had forwarded. Sarah had orchestrated her performance with terrifying accuracy. She was sitting on the floor of a dimly lit room, dressed in an oversized gray sweater, her usually flawless makeup completely absent. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, and she clutched a tissue in her trembling hands. She had weaponized her tears flawlessly, playing the role of the innocent, helpless victim crushed beneath the boot of a wealthy, vindictive corporate tyrant. I never thought I would have to make a video like this, Sarah sobbed to the camera, wiping away a single perfectly timed tear. But yesterday, my sister-in-law, Nia Dubois, the chief operating officer of Dubois Logistics, fired 30 hardworking members of our family without cause or severance. She fired my brother, a man with a wife and children to feed, just because she was going through a bitter divorce with my brother-in-law and wanted to punish anyone connected to him. We tried to reason with her. We went to her home to beg for mercy for these innocent employees. But she laughed in our faces and threatened us with armed security. The video cut to a montage of the Dubois corporate headquarters, highlighting our massive trucking fleets and towering office buildings, creating a stark visual contrast between our billionaire corporate wealth and her supposedly destitute working-class family. She accused me of exploiting their labor, creating a toxic culture of intimidation and throwing them away the moment they were no longer convenient. Beatrice had launched a parallel campaign on Facebook targeting a slightly older, more religious demographic. Dressed in her Sunday best, sitting in front of a wall adorned with crosses, Beatrice delivered a sermon of pure character assassination. She painted me as an arrogant, soulless woman who had abandoned God in pursuit of money. She wailed about how she had welcomed me into her heart only to be betrayed. She claimed I was systematically destroying Black families and tearing down traditional marriages because I was consumed by modern corporate greed. She asked her entire congregation and her thousands of online friends to pray for my hardened heart and to stand in solidarity with the 30 honest people I had supposedly left to starve. The strategy was brutally effective. The internet loves a story about a greedy billionaire abusing the working class. Within hours, the hashtag Boycott Dubois was trending regionally. The comment sections under our corporate accounts were flooded with angry messages from strangers demanding justice for Sarah's brother and calling for my immediate resignation. People who knew absolutely nothing about supply chain logistics or corporate embezzlement were suddenly experts on my character, labeling me a monster, a narcissist, and a disgrace to the business community. When I arrived at the corporate headquarters later that morning, the atmosphere was remarkably tense. News vans were parked across the street from the main gate, trying to get footage of the building. The phones in the customer service department were ringing non-stop with angry complaints from the public. My executive team was waiting for me in the boardroom, their faces pale with concern. "We need to issue a statement immediately," my PR director urged, sliding a drafted press release across the table. "We need to counter their narrative. We need to say these terminations were performance-based and that we are consulting with legal counsel. If we let this trend continue unchecked, it could impact our upcoming contract renewals with the Midwestern distributors. They are very sensitive to negative press." I looked down at the drafted statement and slowly pushed it back across the smooth mahogany table. "We are not issuing a statement," I said, my voice projecting absolute authority. "We are not responding to social media comments. We are not blocking users, and we are certainly not engaging with local bloggers trying to farm clicks off my divorce." The room erupted into nervous murmurs. My legal counsel leaned forward, frowning. "Nia, with all due respect, the optics on this are terrible. They are painting a picture of corporate retaliation. If we stay silent, the public will assume their allegations of wrongful termination are entirely true. It looks like guilt." "Let them assume whatever they want," I replied, standing up and walking over to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the shipping yard below. "I am not running a lifestyle brand or a cosmetic company. We are a commercial logistics and freight empire. The general public raging on social media does not charter our shipping vessels or lease our cargo planes. The people complaining online are not our clients. Our actual clients are multinational corporations and industrial manufacturers who care about delivery times, profit margins, and supply chain reliability. They do not care about my mother-in-law Facebook rants." "But the noise is getting louder," my PR director argued. "What if they file a class action lawsuit for wrongful termination? What if they take this to national television?" I turned back to face my team, offering them a small, reassuring smile. "I want them to be loud," I explained. "I want Sarah to post as many crying videos as she possibly can. I want Beatrice to preach about her victimhood to anyone who will listen. Right now, they feel incredibly powerful because they think they are controlling the narrative. They are digging a massive public hole, and they are inviting the entire world to watch them do it. They are documenting their own slander and putting it on the permanent digital record. My father, Harrison, stepped into the boardroom at that exact moment. He was impeccably dressed, as always, projecting the quiet, terrifying calm of a man who had weathered decades of corporate warfare. He walked over to the table and rested his hands on the back of a leather chair, looking at the nervous executives. "My daughter is right," Harrison stated, his deep voice instantly commanding total silence in the room. "This is a mild, localized media crisis generated by desperate amateurs. We do not negotiate with extortionists, and we do not panic over internet gossip. We are Dubois Logistics. We let the dogs bark at the gate while we secure the fortress." He looked at me, a silent communication passing between us. We both knew the reality of the situation. The media circus outside was annoying, but it was ultimately harmless. It was the desperate thrashing of parasites who had just been detached from their host. They were trying to inflict reputational damage because they lacked the intelligence or the resources to inflict actual financial damage. "Cancel all my internal meetings for the rest of the day," I instructed my assistant, who was hovering near the door. "Reroute all media inquiries to the legal department with a strict no-comment policy. Instruct the warehouse managers to proceed with business as usual. I want every single delivery truck out on schedule." As the executive team filed out of the room to execute their orders, my father walked over and stood beside me at the window. We watched a news reporter setting up a camera on the sidewalk below, pointing the lens up at our towering glass building. "They took the bait," Harrison noted, crossing his arms. "They are putting themselves right in the center of the spotlight, exactly where the federal agents can see them clearly." "Yes, they did," I replied, pulling my phone from my pocket and looking at a new notification. Another video of Marcus had just been posted, claiming he built this company with his bare hands. "They think they are destroying my reputation, Dad. They have no idea they are just warming up the audience for their own public execution." Over the next 48 hours, the digital circus escalated into a full-blown corporate hurricane. The constant ringing of telephones became the permanent soundtrack of the Dubois headquarters. My executive assistant, Valerie, an incredibly sharp woman who had been with me since I took over as Chief Operating Officer, stood at the entrance of my office with a freshly printed call log. Her face remained carefully neutral, but the sheer thickness of the paper stack in her hands betrayed the mounting pressure from the outside world. "The switchboards are completely overwhelmed," Nia Valerie reported, her voice steady, despite the chaos echoing down the hallway. "Activists and local community organizers are organizing a protest outside the Southern Distribution Center. They are demanding a public apology for Sarah Brother and calling for a boycott of our entire supply chain. And the legal department just informed me that Beatrice went on a local morning radio show to discuss how our corporate greed is destroying Black families." "Let them march, Valerie," I said, not lifting my eyes from the quarterly revenue reports on my desk. "Make sure security provides them with bottled water if it gets too hot outside, but ensure they stay exactly 50 feet away from the loading docks. Our freight does not stop moving for anyone. What about our actual business partners?" "That is why I am here." Valerie stepped fully into the office and closed the glass door behind her, shutting out the noise. "Richard Sterling from the Midwest Distribution Consortium is on line 1. He is incredibly anxious. He saw the hashtag trending on Twitter and wants personal assurances that this public relations nightmare will not impact the renewal of our primary shipping contracts next month. He is threatening to explore other logistics providers to protect his own brand image." I nodded slowly, tapping my pen against the mahogany desk. This was the real test. The court of public opinion was nothing but cheap entertainment, but the boardroom of corporate stakeholders was where empires were actually sustained or dismantled. I picked up the receiver and pressed the flashing button connecting me to one of our most lucrative clients. "Richard, it is a pleasure to hear your voice," I said, projecting absolute warmth and unshakable confidence. "I understand you have some concerns regarding the recent noise on social media." "Noise is an understatement," Richard replied, his voice tight with professional anxiety. "My board of directors is panicking. We are seeing videos of your sister-in-law crying about being thrown into the streets. We are seeing your ex-husband claiming you run a toxic authoritarian regime. We cannot have our distribution network associated with a company that is being publicly canceled for unethical labor practices. I need to know what you are doing to fix this immediately, or we will have to start looking at alternative freight options. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring out the window at the Atlanta skyline. Richard, let me ask you a very simple question. Did your shipment of automotive parts arrive at the Chicago sorting facility this morning? There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Yes, Richard admitted cautiously. They actually arrived 3 hours ahead of schedule. And did the boycott stop my drivers from delivering your perishable goods to the Ohio fulfillment centers last night? I continued, my tone remaining perfectly polite but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel. No, he conceded. Everything arrived in perfect condition. Then you have absolutely nothing to worry about, Richard, I said softly. Social media outrage does not delay my drivers. Internet gossip does not break my supply chain. The people crying on television are disgruntled former employees who were terminated for severe corporate misconduct, including embezzlement and gross negligence. I cannot disclose the details because there is an active federal investigation currently underway, but I can assure you that within the next 72 hours, the entire narrative is going to shift drastically. The trash is simply making a loud noise on its way to the incinerator. If you pull your contracts now based on a fabricated media stunt, you will be the one explaining to your board why you abandoned the most reliable logistics network on the East Coast over fake internet tiers. The line went silent for a long moment as Richard processed the weight of my words. The mention of a federal investigation had precisely the desired effect. In the corporate world, nobody wants to be on the wrong side of a federal audit, and nobody abandons a profitable partnership over unsubstantiated rumors when the profit margins are consistently high. I trust your judgment, Nia, Richard finally said, the panic slowly draining from his voice. We will hold our position, but please resolve this quickly. I ended the call and handed the receiver back to Valerie, who had been listening with a small approving smile. One fire extinguished, I noted. How is my father handling his end of the calls? Valerie chuckled softly. He is currently in the executive lounge watching the morning news with a cup of espresso. He requested your presence when you finished with Mr. Sterling. He said his favorite comedy show is on. I left my office and walked down the quiet carpeted corridor to the executive lounge. I opened the heavy double doors to find my father Harrison sitting in a plush armchair, a cup of steaming black coffee in his hand, his eyes fixed on the massive flat-screen television mounted on the wall. He looked entirely unbothered, the picture of a man who had survived economic recessions, hostile takeovers, and ruthless competitors. A group of whining relatives was barely a blip on his radar. "Come in, Nia," my father said, gesturing to the empty chair beside him without looking away from the screen. "You are just in time. Marcus is giving the performance of a lifetime." I sat down and directed my attention to the television. It was a local daytime talk show known for sensationalizing family drama. There sat Marcus looking utterly pathetic. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit because I had immediately frozen his corporate clothing allowance and confiscated his company-issued wardrobe. He leaned forward in his chair, resting his elbows on his knees, looking directly into the camera with puppy dog eyes. In the background, sitting in the front row of the studio audience, was Beatrice, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief, acting like the grieving mother of a martyr. "It is just so painful," Marcus told the sympathetic talk show host, shaking his head in mock sorrow. "I gave up my own dreams to help Nia build her family business. I stood by her side. I managed the staff. I kept the warehouses running when she was too busy attending high society galas. And the moment she felt she no longer needed me, she discarded me like trash. She threw my innocent family members out into the cold without a dime of severance, just to prove she had the power to do it. It is what happens when wealth corrupts a person's soul. She lost her connection to our community." My father let out a deep, booming laugh that filled the executive lounge. He took a sip of his espresso, shaking his head in sheer amusement. "Look at him," Harrison chuckled. He is practically begging for a daytime Emmy nomination. He thinks playing the emasculated victim on local television is going to force our hand. He truly believes this public pity party translates to actual leverage. It is fascinating to watch. I agreed, leaning back and crossing my legs. They are playing completely into the most damaging stereotypes to win sympathy from a public that would never invite them to dinner. They think loud equals powerful. They think a trending hashtag is the equivalent of a corporate mandate. That is the difference between real power and desperate noise, my father said, his expression sobering slightly as he looked at me. Real power does not need to scream on a talk show. Real power does not need to beg strangers on the internet for validation. Real power sits quietly in the dark, gathers the evidence, and waits for the perfect moment to strike. They are burning through all their social capital right now, completely unaware that the ground beneath them has already been rigged with explosives. I watched Marcus wipe a non-existent tear from his cheek on the high-definition screen. My calmness in the face of this character assassination was not a facade. It was born from absolute certainty. I felt no urge to defend myself against their lies because I knew the truth was already locked inside briefcases at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every interview they gave, every post they made, every lie they spun on public platforms was just another nail in their legal coffins. They were creating a massive digital footprint of their own deceit, documenting their fraudulent characters for the judges and the prosecutors who would soon be reviewing their case files. My phone vibrated in my pocket, pulling my attention away from the pathetic display on the television. I pulled it out and looked at the notification. It was an email from my lead corporate attorney. The subject line made a slow, icy smile spread across my face. I looked over at my father, who raised an inquiring eyebrow. Marcus just made his next move, I announced, reading the contents of the email. His lawyers just officially served our legal department with a formal demand letter. He is citing the lack of a prenuptial agreement and the emotional distress caused by his public firing. He is officially demanding 50% of my logistics division, 50% of the residential estate, and a public apology, reinstated across all our corporate channels. They gave us a 24-hour deadline to sign the settlement, or they are taking the lawsuit to the Supreme Court of Georgia. My father slowly set his coffee cup down on the table, a dangerous glint appearing in his dark eyes. So Harrison murmured, a slow, predatory smile matching my own. The rat has finally decided to walk straight into the trap. Let us see how much he demands when he realizes the cheese is laced with poison. Less than 2 hours after that email arrived, my assistant Valerie opened the glass doors of the executive boardroom. She stepped aside to allow Marcus and his legal counsel to enter the room. They had demanded an emergency in-person meeting to discuss the settlement, and I had graciously obliged. I sat at the head of the long mahogany table with my father sitting quietly to my right. Marcus walked into the room with his chest puffed out, projecting a comical level of false confidence. He had changed out of the cheap gray suit he wore on television and was now wearing a dark navy blazer that he had purchased using my American Express card last spring. Beside him walked his attorney, a slick, fast-talking man named Preston, whose expensive briefcase and polished shoes screamed predatory litigation. Preston did not waste any time with pleasantries. He marched directly to the center of the table, unclasped his briefcase, and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He slid them across the polished wood until they came to a rest exactly 2 inches from my folded hands. "Good afternoon, Miss Dubois," Preston said, his voice slick with practiced corporate aggression. "We are here to expedite the resolution of this unfortunate marital dispute. My client has instructed me to present you with a final settlement offer. We believe it is highly generous given the current public relations crisis your company is facing." I did not look at the documents. I kept my eyes fixed on Marcus, who was standing with his arms crossed, trying desperately to look like a man in charge. "Generous," I repeated, my voice flat. "You launch a coordinated media smear campaign against my family name, and now you want to discuss generosity." Preston leaned forward, resting his palms on the table. "Let us speak entirely in legal realities, Miss Dubois. The reality is that you and my client entered into a marriage without executing a prenuptial agreement. Under state law, any wealth generated or appreciation of assets during the 3 years of your marriage is considered marital property, subject to equitable division. During the tenure of your marriage, Dubois Logistics expanded its operations across the East Coast, increasing its overall valuation by hundreds of millions of dollars. My client was your husband during that period. He provided domestic and emotional support that enabled you to focus on your corporate expansion. Therefore, he is legally entitled to 50% of that growth. I felt a genuine laugh bubbling in my chest, but I kept my expression completely neutral. Emotional support, I said, testing the words. Is that what we are calling his affair with a 24-year-old assistant? Infidelity does not negate the absence of a prenuptial agreement, Preston countered smoothly, entirely unbothered by the moral implications of his client behavior. The law is strictly financial. My client has a rightful claim to half of your logistical division, half of your liquid capital acquired during the marriage, and half of the residential estate. If we take this before a judge, the discovery phase alone will tie up your corporate assets for years. Your company accounts will be heavily scrutinized. Your board of directors will be subpoenaed. Marcus uncrossed his arms and placed his hands on the table, leaning in to deliver his personal threat. And it will not just be the courts, Nia, he said, a malicious grin spreading across his face. You saw the news this morning. You saw the protests forming outside your distribution centers. That is just a small sample of what my family can do. Sarah has an exclusive interview scheduled with a national media outlet tomorrow morning. Beatrice is planning to march with local civil rights leaders to protest your unfair labor practices. We will completely destroy the Dubois brand. Your precious corporate clients will drop you like a bad habit the moment the national networks pick up the story. Marcus tapped his finger against the thick stack of papers in front of me, but it does not have to go that far. He continued, his voice dropping into a patronizing tone. I am a reasonable man, Nia. I am willing to call off the dogs. I will have Sarah and my mother issue a public retraction. They will say it was all a massive misunderstanding fueled by high emotions. They will publicly praise your leadership and tell their followers to stand down. I will sign a non-disclosure agreement and walk away quietly so you can go back to being the untouchable CEO you think you are. I glanced down at the documents, taking in the bold legal print. And in exchange for this remarkable display of grace, I asked softly, what exactly are you demanding? Preston adjusted his tie, a shark smelling blood in the water. The settlement outlines a transfer of 30% voting shares in the logistics division, a lump sum cash payment of $20 million, and the deed to the residential estate. We believe this is a highly discounted compromise compared to what a judge would award him in a 50% marital asset split. You sign the transfer documents today, and the media circus ends tonight. I looked at the two men standing before me. They were not negotiating a divorce settlement. They were executing a ransom demand. They were explicitly tying a targeted media smear campaign to a financial payout. It was textbook extortion, beautifully packaged in legal jargon and presented right in front of the hidden security cameras I had installed in the boardroom ceiling. So let me ensure I understand this arrangement with absolute clarity, I said, picking up my pen and rolling it between my fingers. You are telling me that if I refuse to sign over my shares and pay you $20 million, your family will continue to deliberately spread false allegations about my company to damage my business relationships. But if I pay you this ransom, you will suddenly tell the public that your previous statements were lies. You are putting a $20 million price tag on your silence. Preston frowned slightly, sensing the legal trap being laid. I would not use the word ransom, Miss Dubois. This is a standard mutual settlement agreement designed to prevent further emotional and reputational distress for both parties. Call it whatever makes you feel better about your billable hours, Preston, I replied, leaning back in my chair. But we all know exactly what this is. Marcus is using his mother and his sister-in-law as attack dogs to tank my company's stock price, hoping I will be terrified enough to hand over a massive chunk of my family legacy, just to make the noise stop. He thinks the lack of a prenuptial agreement gives him a golden ticket to rob me blind. Marcus let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. It is not robbing when the law says it belongs to me, Nia. I told you last night that you cannot just fire my family and walk away clean. You thought you held all the power because your name is on the building. You thought you could just discard me. Now you are learning that your pride comes with a very steep price tag. Sign the papers, Naya. Sign them right now, or I promise you by tomorrow afternoon, Dubois Logistics will be entirely radioactive. No major distributor will ever sign a contract with you again. My father, who had remained perfectly silent throughout the entire exchange, finally shifted in his seat. He uncrossed his legs and looked at Marcus with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. He looked at my ex-husband the way a scientist might examine a particularly clueless insect walking directly toward a waiting spiderweb. "You talk a great deal about the law," Marcus Harrison said, his deep voice rumbling through the quiet boardroom. "You rely heavily on the absence of a prenuptial agreement to justify your profound greed. But you seem to possess a very narrow understanding of how corporate structures actually operate." Marcus narrowed his eyes, his false bravado wavering under my father's piercing gaze. "I know how marital property works, Harrison. You cannot intimidate me out of what I am owed." I set my pen down on the table and rested my hands on top of the settlement documents. I did not sign them. Instead, I simply pushed them back across the table toward the slick attorney. "I am not signing anything, Marcus," I stated, my voice radiating absolute authority. "You can take your settlement offer, your media threats, and your greedy, pathetic family, and you can march straight to the courthouse. In fact, I highly encourage you to proceed with the discovery phase. I want your lawyers to look very deeply into my corporate accounts, because you are about to discover exactly why I never forced you to sign a prenuptial agreement 3 years ago." Marcus' face hardened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You are bluffing. You will not risk the company." "I am not risking anything," I replied, a cold smile playing on my lips, "because the company you are trying to steal does not belong to me, and it never did." Preston physically recoiled from the table. The slick, predatory confidence that had radiated from him just moments ago vanished completely. He frantically grabbed his stack of legal filings, flipping through the pages, as if searching for a hidden clause that could save him from the absolute disaster unfolding in front of his eyes. "That is legally impossible," Preston stammered, his polished veneer cracking. "Public records clearly list you as the primary shareholder and chief operating officer of Dubois East Coast Logistics. You are the registered owner of this estate." "Chief operating officer is a job description, Preston," I corrected smoothly, leaning forward to rest my elbows on the mahogany table. "It is not a certificate of ownership, and those public shares you researched so thoroughly belong to a corporate holding company. My father restructured our entire organizational hierarchy 3 months before Marcus and I walked down the aisle. Every single asset, including this company, the shipping fleets, the international contracts, and the roof over our heads, was placed into an irrevocable generational trust. I am a beneficiary and an executive employee, but I do not own the principal assets. You cannot divide what I do not legally possess." Marcus stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish. The reality of his colossal miscalculation was finally penetrating his thick skull. He had spent 3 years resenting my power, 3 years plotting how to extract my wealth, and he had based his entire extortion strategy on a legal loophole that never actually existed. "If you do not own the company," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his mounting panic, "why did you not just fire us during the divorce? If you had an ironclad trust protecting your money, why did you let my family stay on the payroll? Why did you wait until yesterday to kick us out?" I let a cold, satisfied smile touch my lips. "You think this is just about a bitter divorce, Marcus? You think this is just about your pathetic affair with a 24-year-old assistant? Let me tell you exactly what I have been doing for the last 8 months while you thought you were outsmarting me." I stood up and began to slowly pace the length of the boardroom. It started in late February. I was reviewing the quarterly expenditure reports for our regional hubs. I noticed a recurring discrepancy in the maintenance budget for the Baltimore facility. It was a minor anomaly, just a few $1,000s here and there, easily brushed off by a lazy executive as inflation or emergency equipment repairs. But I do not brush things off, Marcus. I dug deeper. I bypassed your uncle and pulled the raw data directly from the vendor accounts. I found the fake invoices. Then I cross-referenced the corporate credit card expenditures. That was when I found the repeated charges for that boutique hotel in downtown Atlanta. The room was booked under a phantom vendor name, but occupied by you and Chloe. Marcus visibly flinched. He looked down at his shoes, unable to maintain eye contact as I systematically dismantled the illusion of his intelligence. I did not scream. I continued, my voice echoing in the quiet room. I did not throw your clothes onto the front lawn. I printed every single fraudulent invoice, every credit card receipt, and every falsified shipping log. I walked into my father's office in the dead of night and dropped a binder of your betrayals onto his desk. Harrison nodded slowly, his dark eyes locked on Marcus. We saw the entire picture, my father added, his voice rumbling with quiet fury. We saw that you were not just a cheating husband. You were a parasite attempting to drain the lifeblood of a company my family spent 4 decades building. But firing you was too simple. Firing you would allow you to walk away and repeat your parasitic behavior somewhere else. We wanted to annihilate the entire network of thieves you brought into our home. The next morning, I picked up the narrative. My father made a highly confidential phone call to a contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We handed over the preliminary evidence of your embezzlement. But the federal agents told us they needed more time. They needed an airtight paper trail to prove money laundering, wire fraud, and coordinated corporate theft across state lines. The Internal Revenue Service needed to trace the exact flow of funds moving from our employee union accounts into the offshore shell companies your brother-in-law was using to pay off his illegal sports bookies. I stopped pacing and stood directly behind Marcus, resting my hands on the back of his chair. He was trembling. I could actually feel the faint vibration of his terror radiating through the leather upholstery. Do you have any idea what it cost me to play dumb for 8 agonizing months? I asked, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper right next to his ear. For 8 months, I had to sleep in the same house as a man I knew was stealing from my employees. I had to smile at you over the dinner table while you complained about how my long work hours were damaging our marriage. I had to sit in my living room and let your mother Beatrice insult my femininity and question my devotion to God. I had to watch Sarah flaunt $20,000 handbags that I knew were purchased with money stolen from warehouse workers who break their backs loading freight. I walked back to my seat, keeping my eyes locked on his pale, terrified face. I swallowed my pride. I played the role of the oblivious, overworked executive so that you would feel comfortable enough to keep stealing. You thought you were a criminal mastermind operating brilliantly right under my nose. You thought my dedication to this company made me blind to your extracurricular activities. But every single time you approved a fraudulent invoice, federal agents were logging the transaction. Every time you transferred stolen money to your phantom consulting firm, forensic accountants were mapping the network. We watched you build your own prison brick by brick. Preston, the slick attorney, suddenly looked incredibly ill. He wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead and began shoving his legal documents back into his briefcase with frantic, uncoordinated movements. He realized with horrifying clarity that he had just walked into a federal trap. The divorce was just the catalyst, I explained, gesturing to the empty settlement papers on the table. We knew that the moment I legally ended the marriage and terminated your family employment, you would panic. Your offshore accounts were frozen yesterday morning by federal order, though your bank conveniently neglected to inform you. We knew you would desperately try to secure a massive cash payout before your shell companies collapsed entirely. We needed you to walk into this room and formally demand a multi-million-dollar ransom to suppress a media smear campaign. We needed you to do it on camera to add federal extortion to your rapidly growing list of felony charges. I pointed a single manicured finger toward the small, sleek smoke detector mounted on the ceiling, directly above the boardroom table. Marcus and Preston both looked up, their eyes widening, as they spotted the tiny glint of the hidden camera lens concealed within the plastic casing. You just spent the last 20 minutes threatening to destroy a billion-dollar logistics network unless I paid you $20 million, I said, leaning back in my chair. You explicitly tied a coordinated media attack to a financial demand. You brought your lawyer to legitimize the threat, making him an active participant in an extortion scheme. The audio and video feeds from this room have been transmitting live directly to the federal agents waiting downstairs. Preston slammed his briefcase shut and stood up so fast his chair tipped over backward and crashed onto the carpet. Miss Dubois Preston stammered, his voice shaking with absolute panic. I assure you I had absolutely no knowledge of any criminal activity or embezzlement regarding my client. I was retained strictly for a marital asset dispute. I am officially withdrawing my representation of this client effective immediately. Preston did not even look at Marcus. He turned on his heel and practically sprinted toward the boardroom doors, desperate to save his law license and avoid a federal indictment. But as he reached for the brass handles, the heavy glass doors swung open from the outside, forcing the terrified lawyer to stumble backward. Beatrice stepped over the threshold. First, her chin raised high and her shoulders pulled back, projecting the false regal authority of a queen arriving to collect her royal tribute. She was clutching a designer handbag that she likely assumed was about to be filled with millions of dollars in settlement money. Sarah followed closely behind her, practically glowing with a toxic, self-satisfied smirk. They pushed their way past the frantic attorney, entirely oblivious to the stark terror etched across his sweating face. Preston did not offer them a single word of warning or explanation. He simply used the physical opening they created to squeeze past them, sprinting down the carpeted hallway toward the elevators without ever looking back. Beatrice walked into the center of the boardroom, completely ignoring the fact that her son looked as though he had just been electrocuted. We decided we simply could not wait downstairs in the lobby any longer. Beatrice announced, her voice dripping with fake sweetness and undeniable malice. A momentous occasion like this requires the presence of the entire family. We came to ensure that the transfer of assets was handled properly and to personally witness you doing the right thing for once in your miserable life, Naya. Sarah crossed her arms, her vicious smirk widening as she looked down at me from across the mahogany table. The reporters outside are practically begging for an update, Sarah boasted, her voice echoing loudly in the spacious room. The crowds are getting larger by the minute. I told the news anchors I would give them an exclusive live statement the moment we stepped out of this building. I hope you signed the papers, Nia. The protesters are getting restless, and my brother is eagerly waiting for your public apology and his compensation check. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, to warn them to scream that the room was wired and the federal agents were listening, but his throat was completely paralyzed by fear. He just let out a pathetic, strangled gasp, his eyes wide and fixed on the ceiling where the hidden camera was silently recording their every move. He raised a trembling hand, gesturing vaguely toward the door, but neither his mother nor his sister-in-law paid any attention to his silent breakdown. I remained seated at the head of the table, my posture relaxed, my hands resting lightly on the polished wood. I looked at the two women who had tormented me for years, taking in their arrogant smiles and their absolute blind certainty that they had won the war. I let them savor their imaginary victory for a few seconds longer, allowing the sheer magnitude of their delusion to fill the space between us. I am so incredibly glad you both decided to join us, I said, my voice carrying a smooth, dangerous calm that finally made Beatrice pause her triumphant march. It is only fitting that the primary architects of this extortion attempt are present for the grand finale. It saves me the trouble of having my security team drag you up here from the lobby. I picked up a small silver remote from the table. I pressed the top button, and the heavy motorized blackout shades immediately began to descend over the floor-to-ceiling glass walls, smoothly sealing off the boardroom from the rest of the executive floor. The room darkened, the natural sunlight completely blocked out and replaced by the cool, sharp glow of the recessed LED panels overhead. The sudden isolation shifted the atmosphere in the room, transforming it from a corporate meeting space into an interrogation chamber. I pressed a second button on the remote. Behind me, a massive motorized projector screen quietly descended from the ceiling, unfurling like a blank canvas waiting to be painted with their ultimate destruction. The high-definition projector mounted above the table hummed to life, casting a bright, stark, rectangular beam of light directly onto the screen behind my chair. I reached down to the floor beside my chair and lifted a heavy stack of pristine black leather-bound folders onto the table. I arranged them in a perfectly straight line mirroring the calculated precision of the trap I had laid over the past 8 months. Since you came all this way to discuss the financial redistribution of my assets, I stated, my eyes locked dead onto Beatrice. I decided to prepare a visual presentation. I want to ensure that every single member of this parasitic family fully comprehends the magnitude of the situation you have blindly walked into. Beatrice frowned, her false confidence slipping as she finally glanced over at Marcus. She registered his pale, sweating face, his trembling hands, and the sudden glaring absence of his slick attorney. "Marcus, what is going on?" Beatrice demanded, her voice pitching up with sudden anxiety. "Where is Preston? Did she sign the settlement agreement or not?" Marcus shook his head slowly, stepping backward until his spine hit the wall. His voice was nothing more than a hoarse, broken whisper. "Mom, we have to leave. We have to get out of this building right now." Sarah scoffed, rolling her eyes at her brother-in-law, sudden display of cowardice. "Do not be ridiculous, Marcus," Sarah snapped, taking a step forward to compensate for his retreat. "She is just trying to intimidate us with corporate theater. She is stalling because she knows we hold all the cards, and she is terrified of the media storm waiting outside." "Turn the projector off, Nia. We are not interested in a PowerPoint presentation. We want the signed financial agreement, or I walk downstairs right now and tell the national news networks that you refuse to compensate the family you abused." "You do not hold any cards, Sarah," I replied, standing up slowly from my executive chair and smoothing the front of my blazer. "You are holding a lit match in a room completely flooded with gasoline, and you are far too arrogant to realize you are already burning. You walked into this secure boardroom posing as victorious conquerors. You thought you could stroll into my corporate headquarters, leverage a fabricated media crisis, and walk out with $20 million. I walked around the table, slowly closing the physical distance between us until I was standing just a few feet away from her. But this room was not chosen by accident today, Sarah. This room is a soundproof, digitally isolated environment that has been fully wired for high-definition audio and video surveillance. Beatrice stumbled backward, her designer handbag slipping from her grasp and hitting the carpet with a dull thud. "Wired," Beatrice whispered, the color rapidly draining from her face as she looked up at the ceiling, instinctively searching for the lenses. "Yes, Beatrice," I said, gesturing to the blank screen behind me. "Everything you just said about the reporters, every threat Sarah just made regarding the media smear campaign, and every multi-million-dollar ransom demand Marcus delivered 10 minutes ago has been broadcast live to federal agents waiting on the ground floor. You just handed the Federal Bureau of Investigation a pristine documented confession to corporate extortion." Sarah's mouth dropped open, her face flushing a deep, mottled red as the reality of her self-incrimination washed over her. She looked at the door, then at Marcus, then back at me, completely paralyzed by the sudden, horrific reversal of power. "But before the agents come up here to escort you out of my building in handcuffs," I continued, raising the remote control, "I want to show you exactly what my forensic auditors found. I want you to see the magnificent web of fraud that is going to put your entire bloodline behind bars." I clicked the presentation remote, and the massive screen behind me flashed to life. The bright light illuminated the dark room, projecting a highly detailed, interconnected financial diagram that mapped out every single stolen dollar, every offshore account, and every fraudulent shell company they had desperately tried to hide. The diagram on the screen was a masterpiece of forensic accounting. Crisp red lines traced the flow of capital directly from the Dubois Logistics primary operating accounts straight into 3 distinct black boxes, representing the brilliant entrepreneurial ventures Marcus had secretly constructed. I pressed the clicker in my hand, and the screen zoomed in on the first black box. The bold white text across the dark square read, "Apex Fleet Maintenance." "You thought you were a genius, Marcus," I said, my voice echoing with clinical precision in the soundproof room. "You realize that our regional distribution centers process thousands of maintenance requests every single week, replacing tires, repairing hydraulic lifts, servicing refrigeration units on the massive cargo trucks. It is a chaotic, endless expense ledger. So you quietly incorporated Apex Fleet Maintenance using a registered agent in Delaware to hide your name. Then you used your executive access to approve them as a preferred vendor in our corporate system. You started billing us for brake pads that were never ordered and transmission overhauls that were never performed. You carefully kept the invoices just under the $10,000 threshold to avoid triggering an automatic secondary audit by the finance department. 214 fake invoices over a period of 14 months. Marcus swallowed audibly, his Adam apple bobbing in his throat. He stared up at the screen as if it were a ticking time bomb, his arrogant posture completely deflating. I clicked the remote again, and the screen shifted to the second black box. Global Supply Consulting. This one was your absolute masterpiece of laziness. I continued stepping closer to the edge of the mahogany table. You realized that faking physical inventory required too much administrative effort, so you pivoted to intellectual property. You created a phantom consulting firm and started billing Dubois Logistics for quarterly management seminars, supply chain optimization reports, and employee wellness training modules. You literally downloaded free PDF documents from public internet forums, slapped a Global Supply Consulting logo on the cover, and authorized my accounts payable department to cut checks for $50,000 a pop. You stole from my family business to pay yourself for reading internet blogs. Beatrice was shaking her head violently, refusing to look at the glowing screen. "My son is a businessman," she whispered, though the absolute terror in her eyes betrayed her crumbling faith. "He provides services. This is just a misunderstanding of corporate structure. You are twisting standard business practices to make him look guilty." "There is absolutely no misunderstanding, Beatrice," I replied smoothly, maintaining steady eye contact with my horrified mother-in-law. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation understands corporate structure perfectly. They are not confused by fake invoices, and they specifically understand the structure of the third company." I clicked the remote one more time. The final black box expanded, filling the entire projector screen. Horizon Coastal Ventures. This was the laundering hub, I explained, resting my hands on the table and leaning toward them. Apex Fleet Maintenance and Global Supply Consulting were just the vacuum cleaners sucking the cash out of my company. Horizon Coastal Ventures was the offshore washing machine. You took all that stolen capital, Marcus, and you funneled it into a hidden bank account in the Cayman Islands under the Horizon name. You used that exact same account to funnel the employee union funds that Sarah Brother was actively embezzling. You mixed it all together, creating a toxic pool of stolen generational wealth and stolen working-class wages. You thought crossing international borders would make you invisible to local auditors. I paused, letting the absolute silence of the room amplify the crushing weight of my next words. "Do you know the exact total, Marcus?" I asked softly. "Because I do. My forensic accountants have spent 8 grueling months tracking every single fraudulent penny." I pressed the button on my remote, and the 3 black boxes on the screen dissolved into a single massive number glowing in bright red digital font. $4,280,000. Sarah let out a sharp, strangled gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. Her eyes were wide with a terror that finally pierced through her thick, impenetrable layers of entitlement. $4 million was not a family misunderstanding. $4 million was not a marital asset dispute that could be negotiated away in family court. $4 million was a massive, coordinated federal crime that carries decades in federal prison. "You stole over $4 million from my company in 3 years," I stated, staring directly into Marcus' panicked eyes. "You stole from the truck drivers who missed their children's birthdays to haul freight across the country in the dead of night. You stole from the warehouse workers who pulled double shifts to pay their mortgages and put food on their tables. You stole from my father, who welcomed you into his home and treated you like a son when you had absolutely nothing. And you stole from me, the woman you stood before God and swore to protect and honor." Marcus' legs finally gave out entirely. He collapsed into the nearest leather office chair, burying his face in his trembling hands. The false bravado, the aggressive posturing, the arrogant demands for $20 million, all of it vanished completely into thin air. He was reduced to a pathetic, shrinking shadow of a man crushed by the undeniable weight of his own profound greed. "I did not want to do it," Marcus whimpered, his voice muffled by his shaking hands. "I just wanted to be respected, Nia. I wanted to have something that was mine. You made me feel so small every single day. You had all the power, all the money, all the respect in the industry. I just wanted to build my own nest egg so I could finally stand next to you as an equal." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that made Beatrice physically flinch. "You stole $4 million to soothe your fragile ego." I mocked, my tone dripping with absolute contempt. "You did not want to be an equal, Marcus. Equals work hard. Equals build empires with their own bare hands and sacrifice their sleep to secure their future. You just wanted the heavy crown without having to slay any dragons. You wanted the billionaire lifestyle without putting in the 60-hour work weeks. You are not a victim of my overwhelming success. You are a casualty of your own profound laziness and insecurity." "You forced him into a corner," Sarah suddenly shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, desperate register. She dropped her designer handbag onto the carpet, completely forgetting her previous demands for a public apology. "You emasculated him, Nia. You gave him an executive title, but you never let him make any real decisions. You treated him like a child, so he acted like one. This is your fault for not being a proper, supportive wife. If you had just let him lead, he would not have needed to find his own way to secure his future." I turned my gaze slowly toward Sarah, locking onto her terrified, panicked eyes. I marveled at her absolute refusal to accept accountability. Even when staring at a massive digital projection of federal financial crimes, she was desperately trying to find a way to blame the black woman who had been systematically robbed. "It is fascinating, Sarah," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet level that commanded the entire room. "It is truly fascinating how quickly you are willing to excuse $4 million of corporate fraud just to protect your twisted narrative of traditional gender roles. You are willing to justify grand larceny as long as it helps a mediocre man feel a little bit taller in his expensive suit. But you are not defending Marcus out of some misplaced sense of familial loyalty or moral superiority. You are defending him because you are completely terrified of what happens to you when that offshore bank account gets seized by the federal government." I picked up the remote and prepared to click it one more time. "Because you see, Sarah, the $4 million did not just sit in the Cayman Islands gathering interest. A significant portion of it flowed right back into the domestic economy to fund a very specific, very luxurious lifestyle." I raised the remote and clicked the right directional button. The massive web of red lines on the screen zoomed in, isolating a very specific cluster of domestic transactions. I stepped away from the center of the projection, letting the harsh light cast long shadows across the boardroom as I turned my attention entirely to the woman trembling near the mahogany table. "You spent the entire duration of my marriage turning your nose up at me, Sarah," I began, my voice dropping to a conversational, yet absolutely lethal tone. "You stood in my living room less than 24 hours ago and lectured me about cultivating a soft life. You prided yourself on being the gold standard of traditional womanhood, constantly degrading my ambition and my dedication to this company. You genuinely believed that your status as a stay-at-home wife made you inherently superior to the black woman who was actually out here running an empire." I clicked the remote again. The screen transitioned from the financial web to a highly detailed scan of a property deed. Next to the deed was a corresponding wire transfer receipt bearing the official stamp of a Cayman Islands banking institution. "Let us take a very close look at exactly how your pristine traditional lifestyle was funded," I said, pointing to the projected documents. "This is the deed to your 7-bedroom estate in Alpharetta. A beautiful home, Sarah, truly immaculate. But what I find absolutely fascinating is the origin of your $200,000 down payment. You and your husband claim to survive on a modest single income. Yet this wire transfer proves that the entire down payment for your peaceful harbor was routed directly from Horizon Coastal Ventures." That is the offshore laundering hub Marcus set up to hide the money he was actively stealing from my family business. Sarah's face lost whatever color it had left, transforming into a sickly ashen gray. She shook her head frantically, her perfectly styled hair falling out of its messy bun. I did not know, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper, as she backed away from the screen. I swear, Nia, I had no idea where that money came from. Marcus told us it was a corporate bonus. He told us he was investing in our future. I never asked to see the bank statements. Ignorance is a luxury you can no longer afford, I replied smoothly. And it is also a complete lie. I pressed the button again. A series of email screenshots flooded the projector screen. They were messages sent from Sarah's personal email account directly to Marcus' encrypted corporate address. I read the text aloud, ensuring every single word echoed in the soundproof room. Hey Marcus, the interior decorator needs another $40,000 for the imported Italian marble in the master bath. Can you run this through the fleet maintenance account like we discussed last month? Do not tell your wife, obviously. Smiley face emoji. Sarah let out a sharp, strangled gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. The absolute, undeniable proof of her complicity was glaring down at her in high definition. She was not a naive, innocent housewife who was kept in the dark. She was an active, eager participant in the financial slaughter of my company. She knew exactly which accounts were being drained to pay for her luxury. You did not just look the other way, Sarah. I continued, stepping closer to her until she was forced to look me directly in the eyes. You actively requested stolen corporate funds to finance your vanity projects. You built your entire identity, your entire sense of superiority, on a foundation of stolen money. You bragged about your private Pilates classes, your designer wardrobe, and your perfectly regulated home environment. But every single one of those luxuries was paid for by the working-class people you despise. Your soft life was subsidized by the stolen wages of the warehouse workers and truck drivers who break their backs loading freight at 3 in the morning. Your brother stole from their union relief fund, and you used that exact same dirty money to buy your Hermes handbags. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his forehead against the wall. He knew there was no saving her. He could not even save himself. Beatrice stood frozen, her mouth hanging open as she watched her perfect ideal daughter-in-law be systematically dismantled. You are a fraud, Sarah. I stated, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. You are nothing but a parasite dressed in pastel clothing. And the federal agents waiting downstairs have already secured warrants for asset forfeiture. I clicked the remote, bringing up a live feed from one of my residential security contacts. The screen split to show the front driveway of Sarah's sprawling Alpharetta estate. 2 unmarked black SUVs and a local police cruiser were parked directly in front of her manicured lawn. Agents in tactical gear were walking up her front steps carrying empty cardboard boxes. Sarah let out a piercing, hysterical scream when she saw her home on the screen. No, she wailed, lunging toward the table as if she could physically stop the video from playing. You cannot let them do this, Nia. My children are at school. All my things are in that house. Where are we supposed to go? You cannot take my home away from me. I am your family. You stopped being my family the moment you decided my bank accounts were your personal ATM, I corrected her, my tone turning to ice. And I am not taking your home, Sarah. The United States government is taking it because it was purchased with the proceeds of grand larceny and wire fraud. By the time you leave this building in handcuffs today, that house will be seized property. The luxury cars in your driveway will be impounded. Your joint bank accounts are already frozen. You are going back to exactly what you were before you decided to leech off the Dubois family. You are going back to absolutely nothing. Sarah collapsed onto her knees, right there on the corporate boardroom carpet. The designer handbag she had clutched so tightly spilled onto the floor, its contents scattering around her trembling hands. The venomous, self-righteous woman who had stood in my living room demanding millions of dollars and threatening to ruin my reputation was entirely gone. In her place was a broken, weeping criminal who finally realized that her entire existence had been a house of cards. Please, she sobbed, looking up at me with tears streaming down her face, ruining her carefully cultivated image. I will do anything, Nia. I will testify against Marcus. I will testify against my own brother. Just please do not let them leave me homeless. I cannot survive out there. I do not have a degree. I do not have a career. I gave all that up. I have no way to make money. I looked down at her, feeling a profound, deeply satisfying sense of closure. She was offering to sell out her own blood just to save her own skin. It was the ultimate display of her true character. Then I highly suggest you start looking for employment, Sarah, I said, leaning down slightly to ensure she heard every single syllable. I hear the local fast food restaurants are hiring. Or perhaps you can find a wealthy family willing to pay you to clean their pristine imported Italian marble bathrooms. But you will not be getting another dime from me. You wanted to play the role of the superior traditional wife. Now you get to play the role of a federal defendant. I stood back up, turning my attention away from the sobbing mess on the floor and locking my eyes onto the final target in the room. Sarah was utterly destroyed, her perfect facade shattered into a million unfixable pieces. But I was not finished yet. I raised the silver remote in my hand, preparing to pull the trigger on the woman who had orchestrated this entire parasitic invasion from the very beginning. I turned to look at Beatrice. I turned my attention entirely to Beatrice. She was standing frozen near the edge of the mahogany table, her eyes darting between the sobbing mess of her daughter-in-law on the floor and the terrifying high-definition screen projecting her son's federal crimes. The regal, untouchable matriarch who had marched into my corporate headquarters practically vibrating with righteous indignation had completely vanished. In her place stood a cornered, desperate woman rapidly calculating how to save her own skin. Beatrice took a slow, hesitant step backward, clutching her designer cardigan tightly across her chest, as if the fabric could somehow shield her from the incoming devastation. Naya. She began, her voice trembling, pitching into a fragile, breathless register that was entirely foreign to her. I had absolutely no idea the depths of his deception. You have to believe me. The Lord knows my heart is pure. I am just a mother who trusted her son. I thought Marcus was simply a successful executive. I never would have condoned this kind of wickedness. You know I am a woman of faith, Nia. I would never invite stolen money into my life. I stared at her, letting the sheer magnificent audacity of her pivot wash over me. Less than an hour ago, she was standing in my living room demanding $20 million, insulting my femininity, calling me a failure in the eyes of God, and proudly defending the very son she was now desperately trying to throw under the bus. The moment the federal hammer dropped, her fierce family loyalty evaporated, instantly replaced by a frantic desire to distance herself from the wreckage. Your faith is nothing but a costume, Beatrice, I said, my voice ringing with absolute cold authority. You wear it like a protective shield when it benefits you, and you weaponize it against anyone who refuses to bow to your demands. But you are not a victim of Marcus' deception. You are the primary beneficiary of it. I raised the silver remote and clicked the button. The massive projector screen behind me shifted instantly, wiping away the diagram of the offshore accounts. In its place, a crisp, high-resolution photograph filled the screen. It was a stunning, sprawling brick colonial estate situated behind wrought iron gates in one of the most exclusive, historically Black neighborhoods in Atlanta. It was Beatrice's house. The very same house where she hosted her lavish post-church Sunday dinners, where she paraded her false prosperity, and where she held court to gossip about women she deemed less successful. You have spent the last 3 years bragging to your entire congregation about this house. I continued, stepping methodically toward her. You stood at the pulpit and testified about how your brilliant, hard-working son purchased this magnificent estate for his mother, free and clear. You used this house as physical proof of your excellent parenting and his traditional masculine values. You loved hosting your prayer circles in that massive custom kitchen, looking down your nose at people who actually work for a living. Beatrice swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the bright image of her home. She lifted her chin, attempting to summon a final shred of her matriarchal dignity. My son bought that house for me out of love, she insisted, though her voice lacked any real conviction. He wanted to ensure his mother was comfortable in her golden years. Whatever mistakes he made at your company, do not change the fact that the house is mine. It is in my name. It is my sanctuary. I let out a slow, chilling laugh that echoed off the soundproof walls. My father, Harrison, who had been silently watching the execution, leaned forward in his leather chair, a dark, knowing smile spreading across his face. "That is the most fascinating part of this entire tragedy, Beatrice," I said, tapping the remote against my palm. "You were so blinded by your own greed and so eager to flaunt your new wealth that you never actually bothered to look at the legal paperwork. You just gladly took the keys, hired an interior decorator, using my corporate credit cards, and assumed you were untouchable." I clicked the remote one more time. The beautiful photograph of the estate shrank to the left side of the screen. On the right side, a scanned copy of a certified property deed materialized in sharp, undeniable clarity. I pointed directly at the bold black text, highlighting the registered owner of the property. "Read the name on the deed, Beatrice," Weshty commanded, my voice cracking like a whip. "Read it out loud." Beatrice squinted at the screen, her reading glasses trembling on the bridge of her nose. Her breath hitched in her throat as her eyes scanned the legal document. She did not speak. She could not speak. The blood drained so rapidly from her face that I genuinely thought she might collapse right next to Sarah. "Allow me," I offered, stepping directly into her line of sight. "The registered owner of your pristine holy sanctuary is not Beatrice. It is not Marcus. The property is legally registered to Global Supply Consulting, the exact same phantom company Marcus created to launder stolen money out of Dubois Logistics. You do not own a single brick of that estate, Beatrice. You have been living rent-free in a corporate asset purchased entirely with embezzled funds." "No," Beatrice gasped, shaking her head frantically. "No, that cannot be right. Marcus told me it was a gift. He handed me the deed in a leather binder. He told me it was a family trust." "He lied to you to protect his laundering scheme," I replied without a single ounce of pity. "He needed a physical asset to dump a massive amount of stolen liquid cash, so he bought real estate under his fake company. He parked you inside it to make it look like a legitimate domestic purchase. But the federal government does not care about your son's lies, and they certainly do not care about your Sunday prayer circles. When a multi-million-dollar property is purchased entirely with stolen corporate funds and registered to a shell company, actively under federal investigation for money laundering, it does not belong to you. It belongs to the United States government." Beatrice staggered backward, bumping into the heavy mahogany table. Her hands flew to her mouth, stifling a horrified sob. "The Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation have been monitoring Global Supply Consulting for months." I continued, driving the final nail into the coffin of her arrogance. "They know exactly how the house was funded. They know exactly who pays the property taxes using stolen money, which means, Beatrice, that your beloved estate is currently classified as seized federal evidence." I clicked the remote again, bringing up a live feed from a different security contact. The screen split to show the wrought iron gates of Beatrice neighborhood. Just like at Sarah House, a fleet of unmarked vehicles and local law enforcement cruisers were parked aggressively on her manicured front lawn. Federal agents and windbreakers were already taping bright yellow seizure notices to her grand mahogany front door. Beatrice let out a guttural, devastating wail. She grabbed the edge of the conference table, her knuckles turning white as she watched her entire fraudulent reality crumble to dust on the high-definition screen. "My home," she wept, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate plea. "All my things are in there. My family heirlooms, my clothes, my entire life. You cannot let them take it, Nia. Please, you have the power to stop this. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them the house was a legitimate gift. I will leave the city. I will never speak your name again. Just please do not let them leave me on the street." I stared down at the woman who had made it her personal mission to destroy my self-esteem. This was the woman who had sat in my living room and told me I was an unnatural, aggressive failure of a wife. She had weaponized my race, my gender, and my ambition to make herself feel superior. And now she was begging for my mercy while standing in the ashes of the empire she tried to steal. "You called me an angry, bitter black woman, Beatrice." I said, my voice dropping to a harsh, quiet intensity. You said I was unnatural because I worked hard instead of submitting to a mediocre man. But this angry black woman financed every single one of your Sunday dinners. My long hours and my corporate contracts paid for the roof over your head, the clothes on your back, and the perfume you are wearing right now. You bit the only hand that was feeding your entire lineage because your ego could not handle the fact that a woman was holding the leash. Beatrice sank to her knees, her designer skirt pooling on the floor beside Sarah. Two women who had prided themselves on their traditional superiority were now weeping on the carpet of my corporate boardroom, completely stripped of their stolen dignity. You wanted traditional consequences, Beatrice, I said, looking down at her weeping form. Well, the traditional consequence of grand larceny is federal prison. You are going to lose the house. You are going to lose the cars. The federal government will likely freeze your personal bank accounts by the end of the day to audit every single dollar Marcus transferred to you for living expenses. By tomorrow morning, you will not even have enough money to buy a cup of coffee, let alone hire a defense attorney. I turned away from them, picking up the remote and shutting off the projector. The massive screen rolled quietly back into the ceiling, leaving the boardroom bathed once again in the stark clinical light. I walked back to my chair and sat down perfectly composed, unbothered, and entirely victorious. I had not just cut the parasitic network out of my company. I had burned it down to its very roots, ensuring nothing would ever grow back. Marcus scrambled to his feet, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped his smartphone. He was not ready to surrender. In a desperate final attempt to salvage his crumbling reality, he dialed the direct line of Jonathan, the senior managing partner at the prestigious law firm he had retained. Since the junior attorney, Preston, had cowardly fled the building, Marcus blindly assumed the head of the firm would step in to protect a high-paying client. He hit the speaker button, dropping the phone onto the mahogany table so his mother and sister-in-law could hear the cavalry arriving. Jonathan, he barked, his voice cracking with unfiltered panic. Preston just walked out on our negotiation. You need to get your senior litigation team down to the Dubois headquarters right now. Nia is fabricating federal evidence and talking about asset forfeiture. I need an emergency injunction filed against the Internal Revenue Service immediately to protect my bank accounts and the domestic properties. The line remained silent for a heavy, agonizing moment. When the senior attorney finally spoke, his voice was completely devoid of the deferential warmth he usually reserved for wealthy clients. It was the icy, detached tone of a man actively protecting his own survival. Marcus, I was just fully briefed by Preston. Jonathan stated, his words clipping through the speaker like sharp shards of glass. He called me from the lobby of that building while actively cooperating with the federal agents who are currently securing the premises. You lied to us. You retained our law firm under the strict pretense of negotiating a standard marital asset dispute regarding a prenuptial technicality. You deliberately withheld the fact that you and your extended family are the primary targets of an active federal investigation for corporate embezzlement and multi-million-dollar money laundering. Jonathan, please, Marcus pleaded, gripping the edge of the conference table, his knuckles turning white. It is all a massive corporate misunderstanding. I have the liquid funds to pay your premium retainer in cash. Just get down here and stop them from taking my mother house. You do not have any funds, Marcus, the attorney corrected him sharply. You have stolen corporate capital that the United States government is currently freezing. By bringing my associate into a room to demand a $20 million settlement under the explicit threat of a coordinated media smear campaign, you attempted to make my law firm an unwitting accessory to federal extortion. You actively weaponized our legal credentials to commit a felony. Sarah and Beatrice stopped their weeping, looking up at the phone with wide, terrified eyes. Their last shred of hope was dissolving through the audio speaker. Listen to me very carefully, Marcus Jonathan continued, his voice ringing with absolute finality. Effective immediately, our firm is terminating all representation. We are officially withdrawing as your legal counsel across all civil and criminal matters. We have a strict ethical obligation to the State Bar Association, and we absolutely will not risk our practicing licenses to defend a man who lied to his own attorneys to facilitate a federal crime. Do not call this office again. If you try to contact Preston or any other partner at this firm, we will turn those communications directly over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are entirely on your own." The line went dead with a sharp, definitive click. The automated dial tone echoed through the soundproof boardroom, signaling the absolute and total collapse of their legal defenses. Marcus stared at the darkened screen of his phone, his jaw hanging slack. He had no lawyers. He had no money. He had no leverage. The parasitic network had been completely severed, and they were utterly defenseless against the storm they had brought upon themselves. The automated dial tone was suddenly interrupted by the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swinging open with terrifying force. The warm, ambient light from the hallway spilled into the stark, cold illumination of the interrogation space I had created. 4 individuals stepped over the threshold, moving with the synchronized, rigid discipline of people who carried absolute authority. They were not wearing expensive tailored suits or carrying designer handbags. They wore dark navy windbreakers with bright yellow block letters printed across their backs, identifying them as federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Internal Revenue Service. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a perfectly stoic expression, walked directly toward the head of the table, bypassing the weeping women on the floor entirely. He did not look at my father or me. He locked his eyes firmly on the sweating, trembling man still clutching his dead cell phone. Marcus Dubois, the agent, stated, his voice echoing off the high ceilings with zero room for negotiation. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate embezzlement. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." Marcus did not try to run. He did not try to fight or argue his innocence. The absolute reality of his situation had finally shattered the last remaining fragments of his inflated ego. He stood up on shaking legs, completely submitting to the federal authority in the room. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists cut through the heavy silence, ringing out like a final definitive gavel strike, ending his parasitic reign. As Marcus was being secured, a second agent stepped toward the table, pulling a radio from his tactical belt. "Target secured in the executive boardroom," the agent reported, pressing the transmit button. "Status on secondary domestic targets." A brief burst of static followed before a clear voice crackled through the small speaker. "Secondary target apprehended at the Southern Distribution Center. The brother-in-law is currently in federal custody and transport is en route." Sarah let out a choked, agonizing gasp at the confirmation of her brother capture. Her pristine, traditional lifestyle had officially collided with the brutal, terrifying reality of the federal justice system. The agents began marching Marcus toward the exit, his expensive leather shoes dragging heavily across the corporate carpet. He looked back at me one last time, his eyes silently pleading for a mercy he never once extended to me during our marriage. I simply stared back, my posture perfectly straight, the cold lighting casting long shadows across the polished mahogany table as the architect of my misery was physically removed from my empire forever. The heavy glass doors swung shut, sealing Marcus' fate and leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. Beatrice stared at the closed doors for a fraction of a second before the reality of her own impending homelessness finally broke her. She did not just cry. She collapsed completely, crawling across the carpeted floor until she was positioned directly at my feet. The proud, judgmental matriarch, who had weaponized her religion against me, was now kneeling on the ground, her hands desperately grasping at the hem of my trousers. "Nia, please," Beatrice begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, breathless whine. "Have mercy on an old woman. You cannot let the government take my sanctuary. I have nowhere else to go. I will scrub your floors. I will clean this office. Just tell the agents the house was a legitimate gift. Tell them you authorized it. Please, I am begging you in the name of the Lord." I stepped back, forcing her to release my clothing, and looked down at her with absolute disgust. "The Lord has absolutely nothing to do with this." "Beatrice," I stated, my voice devoid of a single ounce of warmth, "and you are far too late to negotiate. The Internal Revenue Service officially seized that property at 8 o'clock this morning. It was processed for an immediate federal asset auction to begin recovering the stolen corporate funds." My father Harrison stepped forward, his polished dress shoes stopping just inches from Beatrice. Trembling hands, And I purchased it an hour later," Harrison added, his deep voice sealing her doom. "I bought it back using clean, honest Dubois capital." Beatrice looked up, a fleeting, delusional spark of hope flashing in her tear-filled eyes. "You bought it?" she gasped. "Then you can let me stay. You can lease it to me." "We are not leasing it to anyone, Beatrice," I corrected her, delivering the final crushing blow. "We are demolishing it. The bulldozers are scheduled to tear down your pristine brick colonial next Tuesday. We are leveling that monument to your greed and clearing the land entirely. In its place, my father and I are building a fully funded commercial driving academy and community support center strictly for single Black mothers. We are going to take the space where you hosted your hypocritical prayer circles and use it to employ, train, and uplift women who actually work hard to feed their children. Women who deserve a real opportunity, not parasites who steal from them to fund their vanity." Beatrice let out a hollow, devastated wail, burying her face in her hands as her entire world evaporated. Across the room, Sarah's phone suddenly erupted with a shrill, frantic ringtone. She snatched it from the floor, her hands shaking violently as she answered the video call. Even from a distance, I could hear the furious, screaming voice of her father echoing through the speaker. He was practically roaring, demanding to know why federal agents were currently searching his home for financial documents linked to his son. "You ruined us," Sarah's father shouted, the audio perfectly clear in the quiet boardroom. "Your brother is in federal custody because he got caught up in your husband's dirty money. The police are asking us questions about the vehicles and the vacations you paid for. You are a complete disgrace to this family, Sarah. Do not ever call this number again. You are entirely on your own." The call ended with a sharp click. Sarah dropped her phone, her eyes wide and completely vacant. The woman who had prided herself on her traditional perfection had just been entirely disowned by her own biological parents. She had no husband, no brother, no home, and now no family to fall back on. She curled into a tight ball on the boardroom carpet, rocking back and forth in absolute terrifying silence. I left them there on the floor of the corporate boardroom, surrounded by the shattered remains of their entitlement. I did not look back as my security team arrived to officially escort them off the premises for the final time. The air in the building immediately felt lighter, as if a toxic, suffocating gas had finally been vented out through the roof. Hours later, I stood alone in the center of my living room, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The Atlanta skyline stretched out before me, glittering like a massive sea of diamonds against the deepening twilight. The setting sun cast a rich, warm golden light across the polished marble floors, bathing the entire space in absolute tranquility. The frantic pounding at my front gate from the night before felt like a distant, faded memory. My home was a sanctuary once again. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the perfect, undisturbed silence fill my lungs. For 3 years, I had allowed a network of parasites to convince me that my ambition was a character flaw. I had let them weaponize my success, using my dedication to my family legacy as an excuse to drain my resources and insult my spirit. They mistook my patience for weakness and my generosity for an open invitation to conquer an empire they never helped build. But true power does not reside in loud demands or fraudulent victimhood. It lives in the quiet, relentless grind of waking up before dawn and doing the actual work. Independence is not just a financial status. It is an impenetrable armor that protects your peace from people who want to harvest your harvest without planting a single seed. Never apologize for demanding respect. Never shrink yourself to make a mediocre person feel massive. And most importantly, never allow anyone disguised as family to transform your genuine kindness into their personal goldmine. The warm golden light caught my reflection in the window glass. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face, reaching all the way to my eyes. I had lost a marriage that was built entirely on an illusion, but I had successfully bought back every single piece of my actual life. I raised my hand in a silent toast to the glittering city below. The parasitic web was permanently severed, and I was finally entirely, completely free.